Okay, I guess that we can start. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session, and thank you for attending the festival more generally. I am Salvatore Nava. I am a partner at Lear, and this session will be devoted to the presentation of the report that we prepared for the European Commission, titled "Exploring Aspects of the State of Competition in the European Union." So the work that we did, this report was prepared for the European Commission and was prepared in consortium with several other organizations, including Fideres, Verian, University of East Anglia, E.CA Economics, and several Prometeia, of course, and several other academic contributors. So actually I had a presentation. I don't know if that can be projected on the screen. Okay, thanks. Oh, okay, here we are. Okay, so our report is part of a larger effort by the European Commission that was aimed at understanding the competitive dynamics, how competition has evolved in the European Union over the past 20-25 years. And so ours is a support study that has, in parallel to our work, the OECD conducted some work, and DG Comp did also some in-house work. And all of this culminated in the report published by the European Commission entitled "Protecting Competition in a Changing World," and which was also published last June by the European Commission. So the people that you see on this stage are the people that were in charge of the various work streams that make up the study and the various chapters in which the study is structured. So Ennis led the work related to Chapter 2, Price Concentration Studies. Ennis is a professor of competition policy at the University of East Anglia and the director of the Center for Competition Policy. Then Alexis Walckiers is a director at E.CA Economics and was for 10 years the chief economist of the Belgian Competition Authority. And he led the team responsible for Chapter 3 of our report on global superstars. Elena Argentesi is a senior advisor at Lear and a professor at the University of Bologna, and she led the team responsible for Chapter 4 of our study on the relationship between domestic competition and export competitiveness. And finally, Claudio Colacurcio is a partner at Prometeia, and he led the team responsible for Chapter 5 of our study on the cost of non-competition. So before I leave the floor to them, they will provide an overview of their findings. I want to give you just a very high-level overview of the content of Chapter 1 of our report. Chapter 1 is essentially a review of the economic literature that has tried to document how competition has evolved over the past 20-25 years in advanced economies. They do that using several, of course, this task requires trying to measure competition, which is an inherently difficult task because competition is an invisible force. It is a multifaceted process, and there are several aspects to competition. Competition takes many shapes depending on the market that we look at. So measuring competition is actually a difficult task. There are several proxies that are used, and each of them has their own strengths and limitations. Each of them perhaps focuses on certain aspects of the competitive process, disregarding others. Still, maybe by combining different indicators, one can hope to reach a more comprehensive picture of how things have evolved. And so the literature has looked at several indicators. First of all, concentration indicators. And what they find is that over the past 20-25 years, concentration has increased across markets in most advanced economies, including the European Union. Concentration is measured sometimes at the market level, more often at the industry level. Then the literature has also assessed the evolution of markups. Markups are basically the extent to which prices exceed marginal cost. So it's a measure of an indicator of market power. And markups have also been found to have increased on average. Although this average increase hides something that is perhaps quite interesting. So the firms that actually drive this average increase in markups are those that already have a very high markup, those that are at the top of the markup distribution. And also relatedly, something else that was observed in the literature is that firms characterized by a high markup captured an increasing share of the sales in a market or industry, whereas other firms in a market, or in an industry did not see a change in their markup. So this effect is largely driven by those firms at the top of the markup distribution. And finally, the literature looks at indicator of business dynamism and finds also, there are some perhaps concerning signs, in the sense that entry rates seem to have declined over time. The average firm age has increased, and the rate at which market leaders are displaced from their leadership position has also decreased. So overall, the picture that emerges is that perhaps we face, compared to the past, we face markets that are more concentrated. We face markets that have a more asymmetric market structure, with a larger gap between market leaders and the other firms in a market. And we also observe that there is more entrenchment in that leadership positions in an industry or a market are becoming harder to challenge. So the literature also tries to investigate what's behind these changes, what's behind these trends, what has determined them. And of course, as you can imagine, there are several potential explanations for these dynamics that we observe. For instance, a candidate that's been explored is the possibility of under-enforcement. However, we should also keep in mind that these changes are not specific to the European Union. They are shared across most of advanced economies. They involve the US as well. And so maybe the reason is a factor that is common across advanced economies, whereas perhaps the level, the intensity of competition enforcement is somewhat heterogeneous across jurisdictions. So it may be a partial explanation, but not the full story. So one driver that seems to draw some consensus among scholars is that of the digitalization of the economy and the related rise of investment in intangible assets. So basically, what the literature has documented is that in many sectors of economic activity, companies have increased their investments in things like the development of customized software, the development of the tools for data collection and analysis, and also proprietary IT solutions that allow more efficiency of operations to reduce the cost of operations. So there has been a significant rise in this investments in intangible assets that in some cases also surpass investment in tangible assets. And this type of investment is peculiar. It has peculiar effects. It has different effects on the competitive process compared to other types of investments, say investments in physical assets, because this type of assets delivers quite extreme economies of scale. This type of assets can be used in many different markets at low or zero marginal cost, and they provide a significant cost advantage and potentially other advantages to those firms that are large enough to make these investments, thereby widening the gap between leaders in a market and the others, and potentially in a self-reinforcing dynamic. And there also another peculiar characteristics of these investments is that they are highly customized and they are highly integrated with the other assets of a company, which has, again, significant implications on the competitive process, because compared to other types of innovations, this type of innovation does not diffuse as well among players in an industry. So for followers, it's not easy to copy and adopt those technologies adopted by industry leaders. And also being so specific to the operations of a firm, these investments entail sunk cost. They represent a sunk cost for someone that wishes to enter a market, and this contributes to raising barriers to entry. So maybe the upshot is that the winner-take-most dynamics that we have observed and documented for the past 10, 15 years in digital markets are not exclusive to digital markets. Digitalization is contributing to spreading them more widely across the economy. So I will stop here and leave the floor to Sean, who will provide an overview of Chapter 2 of the report.
Okay, thanks very much, Salvatore. It's a great pleasure to be here with everybody today. I'm really a marketing guy today, because what I want you to do at the end is think, I'd like to go read the report. And maybe it's just read particular parts of the report, because it's quite an extensive document. It really has, it's a tremendous source of information on many topics. So I would recommend going to look at it. Now, in terms of my part, the part that I worked on for the report, which dealt with price and concentration, I just start out by noting that price and concentration studies have something of a bad name in industrial organization economics, at least historical ones do, because they ignored some important statistical questions about relationships between variables. And in particular, it makes some sense that there would be a strong relationship between price and concentration. So if you do a simple analysis of price and concentration levels in different geographic markets or different industries, you're not going to necessarily end up with a statistically reliable statement. So that's what we would call an endogeneity problem, because the two are related to each other. But we do have some parts of our work where we've really tried to address this problem quite rigorously, and I think it's valuable to do that. But so in particular, we have two sectors we've looked at where I think I would really recommend looking at what we've done. The first is, and this is group work. I need to thank everyone in the group who was involved in this. It's both people working on the data with us and also our partners on the project, especially you, Salvatore. For airlines, there is something of a relationship between price and concentration, and it's at the what's important is to think about the right markets, the right geographic markets. If you look at Europe as a whole, it's not a very concentrated market for airlines. But if you look at routes or countries, you get a much more stark figure of concentration. And so there is a pretty clear relationship that's positive between the number of airlines that are active on a route and the fare per mile. That we can suggest, and it's a relationship that exists both in the EU and the US. The difference in prices might be, on average, on the order of 5% higher in a monopoly route, but I think these numbers are just hiding all sorts of information in the details, because if you have booked an airline fare recently, and I think some people did that just to come here today, there's enormous variation in these fares. There's going to be some people paying quite a bit more than 5%, perhaps, and some maybe no more at all. What we did that I think is worth talking about is to focus on an instance in which one major airline exited the European market in 2017. And that's when Air Berlin left. Air Berlin did not just serve Berlin. Air Berlin was really quite a large airline. It had more than 600 routes that it was connecting. And just in terms of the EU airlines, it was number 7 in 2016 in terms of number of passengers. What we could do was look at what happened on those routes where it was present before it exited, and see what happened. And we could also compare to routes where it hadn't been present. The short story, and there was a lot of variation on these routes, just to be clear. So there were quite a few routes where there were other operators, whether 1, 2, or 3 other operators. But the number of operators on routes was somewhat constrained, and you can imagine that when one airline exits, that was an instantaneous exit. They were out of cash. But it's hard for other airlines to enter quickly on a route. It's something that takes planning, it takes investments, it takes acquiring new resources like planes and new personnel and training them and you can't just snap your fingers and enter 600 routes, for example. And 600 routes is really, that's indirect flights, so that's not necessarily, that's including indirect, so that's not the number of direct flights, but it's still quite hard to enter routes fast. So what happened is that if you look at prices, so this is the table on the upper right here, there was a fairly dramatic impact on prices, and and it was pretty much instantaneous. And this is over time, from 2015 to 2019 or so. And what you see is that there was a jump in prices that is indicated by the pinkish area, and it was up to 20%. So it was a lot higher than the average result that was coming out of the typical regressions. And then that price difference fell with time. That's exactly what one would expect if entry takes a while to occur, that price difference from higher concentration would eventually be much reduced in the market. So there was a short run effect, a medium run effect, therefore, so over 2 years is a lot smaller. It's much more like what we see in the regressions. But I think this is a really interesting experiment to deal with this endogeneity problem. What happens when there's a sudden change in market structure that was not completely predicted? Certainly the moment at which it occurred would have been hard to predict, and others were not ready just to jump in and replace Air Berlin. So that's one study that I think is worth thinking about more, and maybe one could have hypotheses about what the bias is of the endogeneity effect, that is the true effect of concentration on price higher than the one that comes out typically from regression studies is a question worth asking. Now, the other one that we did, which I wanted to talk about in depth, is related to mobile telecommunications, and the motivation for doing the study is almost historical, I'd say, because now it's obviously relevant given the two studies that we've heard about here, including the Draghi study and the Letta study that have come out. I mean, they're picking on the telecom area as the one where we should allow more concentration, and suggesting that this really we should aim to have three major mobile telecom companies in European countries, and it would be a good thing if it was the same company across Europe. So that's a gross simplification, perhaps, of what's being suggested in these reports. But what we've done actually is a lot of work that's related to this question of 4 versus 3, because basically that's the question, 4 versus 3. If you look around Europe, you have countries with 4 operators, you have countries with 3, you don't have countries with 7 networks. You do have another type of operator that has become important in the last 10 years, which is called the virtual network operator. And so one of the things that we've done in our study that adds to prior work is to take in seriously this idea that virtual network operators might be influencing competitive conditions in mobile telecom. And what we did was to build on some of the approaches that have been used in the literature in recent years, add in this focus on MVNOs, and also treat prices slightly differently, perhaps, than some of the prior studies, and seriously examine investment and the relationship between concentration and investment, which is a hard problem. Intuitively, one might have a prediction that the less concentrated markets will have lower prices, and I could just put a delta in front of that, say, making markets less concentrated will lead to lower prices. But the investment effect is really uncertain. It's not obvious how that's going to play out. But one would imagine that if there's very aggressive price competition between companies, there'll be less funds available for investment, for future quality improvement of networks, and this is a live question, obviously. So what have we done here? We've got 2 measures of market structure that we use. The first is the number of MNOs, because one could imagine that that will be deeply related to market structure. It's hard to change quickly, and is coming from regulator decisions in many countries rather than pure market decisions. And then we've also looked at Herfindahl indices using instrumental variable approaches to estimate them, hopefully with less of an endogeneity problem than would otherwise arise. But I think what's really worth starting out with here is to look at some changes in market structure that have occurred in a couple of countries. And so the blue line here is showing what happened to market concentration after there was entry in France by a fourth operator. That was a major entry event, which has been discussed in an interesting paper by Marc Bourreau. And then there was a merger in Germany that changed concentration very rapidly and suddenly. And so there have been some changes in concentration that are arguably exogenous, or their timing is exogenous. But what's going on with the average, what it can be called the average revenue per user, it's the average revenue per connection, actually. And over the period of 2010 to 2000 to 2019, it's what we see is that the markets with 4 MNOs, these are the network, the true physical networks, those markets had lower prices than the ones with 3 MNOs pretty much across the time period. If you look at the US prices, they are almost double the size of the EU prices over the entire time period. This is very hard to explain, and I'm not going to try to suggest what the reasons for that might be. But in some sense, it seems that there is less aggressive competition between mobile operators in the US, and that's been going on for a long time. Now, in terms of capital expenditure, there are lots of ways to look at capital expenditure. One thing we have focused on is aggregate expenditure, and one can see that where there are 4 MNOs, there does seem to be higher expenditure than when there are 3. But if maybe that can be biased somewhat by the size of countries one's looking at. So I wouldn't place any high reliability on these kind of average numbers. We really need to do more detailed analysis. If you look at the per connection investment levels, there you would find slightly higher investments than with the 3 operator situation, than the 4 operator situation. And what I'd argue is we really need to be controlling for country size and some other factors when we're thinking about capital expenditure. So just a few observations. These country effects could obviously be quite important, because we might imagine there would be fixed effects, fixed costs that would be substantial for networks. So we need to, and the geographies can differ a lot. A flat country has very different needs of mobile towers than one with a lot of hills. So we've got analyses of prices, analyses of investment, and I'll just focus on some of the results we've got coming out of these statistical analyses. There's a positive relationship between market concentration and MNO's prices, which we've tried to deal with the endogeneity problem here, so it may be somewhat meaningful, suggesting that there's a 7 to 9% price reduction when you have 4 operators compared to 3. So that's a very real, substantial gain for consumers, and the question is, what's going on the other side, the investment side? This is what we're hearing about in the Draghi report, for example. Well, here what we found was based on looking at aggregate investment per country. It was very hard to get consistent information on operator investment per countries, but aggregate data was there. And here we found in our results, which I'm not going to say they're the final word on this question at all, but they were finding a negative relationship between market concentration and aggregate investment. And finally, I just note that for the mobile virtual network operators, they don't seem to pose much competitive constraint on MNO's pricing, curiously. You might wonder why that might be, so we have a theory of why that might be, which is that MVNOs I think many of us would have seen supermarkets, for example, having pretty low price offers for mobile services and others as well. MVNOs segment out the demand for mobile telecommunications, and the more price-sensitive customers will typically move over to the MVNOs. What does that mean for the MNOs? It means that they end up, if they're the ones with the higher prices, and they are empirically observable, they will be the ones who will have less price-sensitive consumers, and that means that potentially they can raise their prices to those consumers. So MVNO competition might not serve to bring down the prices of the MNOs, is the point. And so just a few other sectors we looked at included beer. These are simple price concentration diagrams, and focused on a few countries for which we could find data. And this information is all in the report as well. I'm not going to draw strong conclusions from these parts of the study because we could not control for the endogeneity problem well here. But just in terms of cement, for example, national average concentration numbers do not reflect regional ones necessarily. So that's another reason not to go to the bank on these numbers. And talking about banks, there does seem to be something of a relationship between price and concentration for mortgage rates, which a lot of us have to deal with. So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Let me bring you to the next station on our journey. I'll talk a little bit about superstars. And basically, the reason why we do that is that usually economists are, concerned by the average, but sometimes it makes sense to look at the tail of the distribution, i.e. the biggest, the end of the distribution, so the biggest, most profitable firms. And that's what we were asked to do. So you have the first person who in economics spoke about superstars was Sherwin Rosen, and I guess that this is a little bit of an eye test for the ones at the end of at the back of the room. But so he said back in the 80s, most of you were not born, I guess, but I was. The phenomenon of superstars, wherein relatively small numbers of people earn enormous amounts of money and dominate the activities in which they engage, seems to be increasingly important in the modern world. So the modern world is 45 years ago. In certain kinds of economic activity, there is concentration of output among the few individuals, marked skewness in the associated distribution of income, and very large rewards at the top. And that's basically a little bit what we are looking. So we are looking for these big firms, and our work was much less econometric than the work you have heard before. We will just, go and identify these big firms and look a little bit in which sector they are active, how the profitability has evolved, and we have a couple of other very lean in terms of econometrics, kind of indicators. But, and this is the next bullet, these firms are important. They are important because, their activity is important in total. They are few, but they are very big, and so they have an importance. And especially for competition specialists, obviously they are bigger, and we have also indicators that show that basically they are also the subject of a lot of economic investigations. For those of you who have heard about the superstars in economics, our definition of superstars will be something a little bit different in the sense that we do not have a market-by-market analysis. So we look at big global firms, which can be eventually quite small or not dominate, if you want, the markets on which they are active, because they are active across the globe, and there is no relation to dominance, market shares, and things that we would look at in competition economics. And there is also, we are quite neutral at this stage on what is the causes of, what you will see is that they have become more profitable, but we are totally agnostic at this stage on what are the causes. So Salvatore has, discussed some of the literature. So, in part, its sectors have become different. You have, to some extent, winner takes all or winner takes most. That's kind of nothing to do with competition. It could be also that competition might be important, but we are quite agnostic, at this stage on the causes. So what we are just looking at is, identifying these big companies and look at their profitability. So how did we do that? We started with the global Fortune 500 data, and the advantage of this data is that you don't only have listed companies, you also have non-listed companies, state-owned companies, and so it's a broader set of companies. And you also, well, they do a lot of work in, consistency of data across the different firms they look at, because obviously it's difficult to look at firms across the world. And what we have done based on this data is, these are the 500 biggest companies in terms of turnover, but we have looked at profits, absolute profit, and profitability. And we have called global superstars, out of these 500 companies, the 50 companies with the highest indicator of profits and profitability. And then we have looked at what happened to these global superstars. And in order to smoothen out the peaks, we have looked at them 5 years by 5 years in order to have, some kind of more smooth indicator. And who are the global superstars? Again, sorry for the people at the back of the room. These are listed, and I happen to have presented this study last week at my home university in Brussels, and one of the corporate finance professors, basically who cannot be seen as any kind of leftist, said, well, you call them global superstars, but actually they are global villains, because you have these petrol producers, tobacco producers, and then he said, and a number of them tend to sell too much sugar, and obviously there are pharmaceutical companies as well which would compensate on the sugar you eat. Yet the type of firms that you have here at the top are not the GAFAMs, or not only the GAFAMs. Obviously, Microsoft is persistent at the top, but you have other firms in very different sectors. And I must say that, the first time, so we are organized in teams, and I'm not the one who has first seen the data, but the first time I was shown the data, this was a bit of a surprise to me, because the type of companies that you have there at the top were not necessarily the one I was expecting to get at the top. And we have put on the right of the graph, which would be there for you, the origin. And so you see that quite a number of them are US firms, but you have also a bunch of European firms. You have an increasing number of Chinese firms. And so basically, you have some kind of representativity, knowing that half of them are typically US firms. Now, they come from a very broad range of sectors, and you see that, there are many colors out there, maybe a little bit too many. We have aggregated these sectors, so they are broad sectors. But interestingly enough, you have quite a lot of pharmaceuticals, you have mining and oil, you have FMCG, so fast-moving consumer goods, including tobacco producers, and you have a number of software and electronics firms, especially towards the end of our analysis. Now, these are the lists of the firms. So you have understood we have looked at 25 years, 5 years by 5 years. So we have 11 firms which were amongst our global superstars for the five of the five periods. And those are many pharmaceutical companies. You see 5 pharmaceutical companies. Food and beverages are Coca-Cola and Nestle. You have Intel as well, Microsoft, Philip Morris, and Procter & Gamble. And those have been at the top for the last 25 years. And you have a number of companies who have been there 4 out of the 5 periods. This shows entry. So the idea is that the longer the bar, the more entry you have had at the top of, so we have ranged these companies sector by sector, and we have tried to see how many new companies would have entered, the global superstars. And you see that for pharmaceuticals and households and personal products, so FMCGs and pharmaceuticals, the box is totally empty, which somehow means that there is very little entry and exit from the companies which are at the top of this distribution. Now we have looked a little bit at profit and profitability. And again, sorry for the eye test for the people at the back of the room, but what you see on the right graph here is these lines represent the revenues, the evolution of revenues. They are normalized to 100, so they increase, but we have normalized them to 100. And there is a purple line which represents the global superstars, and a golden line which represents the Fortune 500 companies. And what you see is that in terms of revenues, it's not that global superstars have increased their revenues much more than others, but what you see at the bottom of the distribution is the profitability. And there you see that actually the profitability of these global superstars has increased quite a lot and consistently over the period. And we found that this was an interesting result. What you see on the other graph, which is here for you, sorry, is the same kind of evolution, but with deciles. And you see that it's really at the top of these global superstars that the difference is more marked. Now we have, it's a little bit difficult to summarize that, but we have also looked at barriers to entry. So competition economists would think that barriers to entry need to be looked at market by market. And so this was a bit of a different exercise in which we looked at, global sectors, and I think that there is only that much you can achieve in looking at sectors in general, yet it's, I think, an interesting exercise in the sense that some of these companies are in sectors where there are a couple of barriers to entry which are meaningful. And we have identified, after a market review, but Salvatore has basically told you about, the review of the literature and others. So this will be repeating in part what Salvatore said earlier. Brands have been seen as important, especially in the fast-moving consumer goods sector, direct and indirect network effects in the IT sector, as well as intangible, as Salvatore argued earlier. In the pharmaceutical sectors, obviously patents play an important role, and acquisition of growing companies as well. I could go in more detail, but I think that, let's spare a bit of time for the discussion ahead. Over to you.
So this part of the study instead deals with a different aspect of competition, and in particular the relationship between competition domestically, so in the internal market for our firms, and export competitiveness. So this is an issue that is very much, I think, important nowadays. Is one of the main issues in the relationship between competition and competitiveness is one of the main issues that is also discussed in the Draghi report, and this part of the study I think contributes to understanding so in particular the relationship between competition and export competitiveness. So we did this, so we analyzed this issue through a survey among exporting companies, so EU companies that export outside the EU and operate in leading export sectors. So I'm gonna be more precise in a second. So what we do is basically test on these, through this survey, some of the hypotheses that are there in the literature, and that I'm going to summarize here in a while. So the main idea is that competition may foster productivity of firms, efficiency, and innovation. And this idea goes back to Porter in the 90s. So competition may affect export performance at many levels. So you may think of competition in input markets, and generally the literature there is quite unanimous in saying that there's a positive effect of competition in input markets, because competition in input markets drives prices down, input prices down, it improves the quality of inputs, and therefore boosts firms' performance in export markets. As for competition in the own market, well, most of the literature still thinks that there's a positive effect, and the idea is that competition incentivizes firms to improve their quality, to be more efficient, and to invest, and therefore it makes also them more effective in being competitive on the global stage. Still, there's a strand of the literature saying that there might be a negative effect, because domestic competition may negatively affect the firm performance on the global stage by constraining their scale, somehow not allowing them to reach a scale that allows them to be competitive on the global market. So we are going to test somehow this hypothesis through a survey that we administered to almost 400 European firms. These firms are chosen to be in sectors that are leading export sectors, either at the country level, so we analyzed 11 member states, and we took the 20 top export sectors for each member state, based on both the value of export and the share of the country's global trade. And so the 20 top sectors for each state, and the 40 top export sectors at the EU level. So this is the way in which we identify the sector. So we took exporting companies in these sectors. And essentially what we did is to ask them questions to analyze, on the one hand, the evolution of domestic competition in these markets, and in particular to analyze questions to dig into the issue of the relationship, the perceived, from their point of view, relationship between competition in the domestic market and their export performance. So what are the main findings of the survey? The main finding is perhaps that competition matters. So these firms, the respondents, they perceive that competition is indeed important for their export performance. In particular, 80% of them believes that competition in upstream markets, in particular in physical goods, physical inputs, is important for their export performance. So for input market, I mean, this confirms what the literature says. Competition in input markets matters a lot. But also competition in the domestic market for the own product and competition in input services matter for 2/3 of the firms that we interviewed. So let's try to get a better understanding of this main finding, in particular by analyzing the competition at the different levels. So we asked them questions on inputs markets, both for goods and services. And I'm summarizing here the main findings. For goods, so physical inputs, so consider that most of these firms procure their main inputs in the EU, so competition in the EU matters for them. What I think is the main finding for the goods market is that quality of the input is the main factor that matters for their export performance, followed by price, but still quality seems to be more important than price when talking about the inputs and the impact of the inputs on their export performance. When we talk about services, I think it's interesting to understand what are the services that mostly affect their export performance. And here we have transport and logistics is the first one, and then we have energy, and then we have IT and telecoms. So these are the three main factors that affect their export performance. And here as well, also for services, we see that the quality of the input is what matters more for their export performance. When we turn instead to the domestic market for the export product, so not talking about the inputs, but about the market in which they are active and in which they export, basically. I think it's interesting to see what the respondents say or think about the channels that are identified in the literature and that can affect, through which competition can affect export performance. And what we see here, I don't know if you can read, but what we see is that the first three lines essentially represent the positive channels. And most of the respondents seem to agree with the fact that competition has a positive effect. The main effect is through an improvement in quality. So most of the respondents, I think more than 80%, agree with the statement that domestic competition incentivizes them to improve product quality. And so that's the main positive channel, but still there are the other two channels that are also very relevant, which is improving efficiency and also allowing them or incentivizing them to increase investment and innovation. Interestingly, most of the respondents disagree instead with the statement that competition may limit their ability to reach a scale. So the last row represents, if you want, the negative channel, and most of the respondents, 2/3 of them, disagree with the statement that domestic competition may prevent them to reach a scale that enables them to be competitive on a global scale, at a global level. Overall, it's interesting to see that what is the perceived effect of domestic competition on performance. So this figure represents, the share of respondents that think that competition matters or doesn't matter, and if it is positive or negative. And I think there are two interesting findings here. Well, the first one is that, not surprisingly, given what I said before, is that the share of respondents that believe that the competition has a positive effect is 3 times as large as the share of those who believe that the negative effect. The second interesting finding, I think, or puzzling perhaps at first sight, is that there is quite a large share of respondents that believe that competition has no effect. So at the beginning, when we found this, we were a bit surprised. But then what we did, so almost 40%, then what we did is to break up this finding, this question, by concentration level. Well, concentration level, perceived concentration level, because we have a question or some questions on the number of competitors, relevant competitors that the respondents perceive to have in their domestic market. And we broke down this question by this number, which somehow represents the degree of, if you want, concentration or perceived concentration in the market. So what you can see is that in more concentrated markets, so the left-hand column, it is there that respondents tend to believe that there is basically no effect of competition, which is not very surprising because probably there is not much competition there in these markets, and therefore competition for this kind of respondents doesn't have, for the firms that are active in these markets, doesn't have much effect. Interesting, though, what we observe is that in markets that are less concentrated, look at the right-hand column, what happens is that the share of those who believe that competition doesn't matter shrinks, but also it's interesting to see that we have kind of more polarized views, no? We have more people that believe that, more firms that believe that the competition is a positive factor for competitiveness, and others that believe that is negative. I mean, this is not surprising. Still, the share of those who believe that the effect is positive is much larger than those who believe that it is negative. But what happens is that, in markets that are more, less concentrated and therefore probably where competition is more intense, what may happen is that, of course, there is a race between, and there are losers and winners, and losers tend to think that the effect is negative, and instead the winners tend to think that the effect is positive. So remember that in our survey, we are not able to pick the main exporters. We know only that these firms are exporters in leading sectors. We are not picking the best exporters. Finally, an interesting finding that I want to mention, I think it's something that emerged throughout the whole questionnaire, is the importance of quality. I already told you that quality seemed to be an important factor for input markets, but also for the market for their own product. Quality seemed to be, for the respondents, the main aspect for product success in the domestic market. But also, most of the respondents said that the decisions about product quality are the first ones to be affected by the intensity of competition in the market. So what this suggests is that quality, improved product quality, is an outcome of the competitive process. Also, as I already said, the incentive to improve quality is the main channel through which competition, domestic competition affects competitiveness, export competitiveness. Let me conclude by summarize the main findings. So domestic competition seems to have a relevant and positive impact overall on export performance. The channels identified in the literature are confirmed by the survey results. In particular, the positive channels seem to be there. We don't find evidence I mean, most of the respondents don't agree with the negative channel, if you want. We do find somehow a relationship between the impact of competition and the level of perceived concentration in the market. And we find that quality is important. Product quality is a key dimension of competition, both in the domestic market and of success in export markets. Thank you, and I leave the floor to Claudio.
Thank you, Elena. Okay. It's okay. I wrote it myself, I know. Okay, let me start. As the last speaker, usually the last word belongs to the one that brings it all together. And I think our chapter had this privilege because we look at competition through the lenses of the whole economy. We look at the macroeconomic effect of competition, and I mean, it was challenging, but it was an honor from the very beginning. When we first got the name of our assignment, which was to measure the cost of non-competition. I wrote in the slide that words are dress of thoughts, or like words are important, since we're close to the Nanni Moretti movie theater. Words are important because the cost of non-Europe has been used in several seminal work that measure what was the positive impact of the EU, of the pillar of the EU, so the freedom of movement of people, of goods, the free trade, the common market. So the idea to use again this word in a study over competition was an honor, because we felt that we were dealing with one of the pillar, one of the principle of the EU. If Salvatore said how hard it is to define competition, our first challenge was also to decide what was the cost of non-competition. I mean, how do we want to approach our assignment? And as economists in Prometeia, we are all economists. We assume we look at the impact of competition through the channel, through the components of the GDP. For those who did Economics 101, the GDP is the sum of consumption, investment, net export, government spending, and as you can see, also through the discussion we had during the panel, competition affects each of these components. For sure, it affects consumption, because through the prices it creates incentive to buy, and also impact on the purchasing power of the people. It impacts on investment of firms, because they decide to invest more because there is competition, or they have resources to invest more because they have more profit through the lack of competition. And there is also an impact in the export competitiveness, as Elena just reported. So our task was to go through each of these channels. The way we did was to do an approach that link microdata and macro data. I mean, the problem with having just a macro approach to competition would be to average apple and oranges. I put in the slide the Trilussa chicken, since we are since we are in Rome. No, through the micro data, we work through, I mean, more than 100,000 financial data of real European firms. We can control the competition through the lenses of the sector. We split our analysis for almost 40 sectors, for more than for like 23 European countries, and so our results, for sure, I will give you, at the end of the presentation, I will give you a number. It will be just one number. But it's not an average, it's a combination of sectorial effect, country effect, type of firms effect. And we combine this effect through a proprietary macroeconomic model where we have the opportunity to look at the short-run effect of a shock. In this case, it would be a shock on competition, but it could be shock on any other sources. We can combine short-run effect and long-run effect. And I think this model was kind of perfect for our assignment, because we want to look at the short-term impact, but also how competition shape the economy in the long run. We have, projection on growth that goes beyond 20 years. In 20 years, many things change. It's not that everything stayed the same. So, using this long-term model, we can combine both effects. Salvatore, in his introduction, he already defined that there is no one single indicator of competition. There is no the best one. You have to choose the one that fit better with your scope. In our case, we went through. We choose to use markup. Markup has several advantages for our study. Like, first of all, it was a firm level data that actually allow us to leverage on the heterogeneity of the firm data we have. It was also not affected by the multi-sector firm, by the market definition, because we have one data for every single firm. It was also widely used in the literature, and that was very important also for the, let me say, environment where we did our study. The Commission wanna stay on the safe side. I mean, wanna us to be backed by a large body of literature and economic and economic research. And a lot of studies discuss competition, discuss the evolution of competition by monitoring the markup. And then it was also, a practical advantage because markup is, let's say, one of the ingredients of our model. We didn't have to do transformation to put markup into our macroeconomic model, so that our impact was more sound, was more direct. What did we find in this first step of the work? Well, we basically found confirmation. We basically found confirmation. We calculated the EU turnover weighted markup. We look at the evolution over time, and we found that increase that at the beginning of the presentation was found by a large body of literature. We also find that sectorially speaking, I mean, each sector has its own story, and on average we found that industries that are more exposed to competition, like the exporting sectors, are actually have a lower markup, so low level of market power. Because at the end, was this market power what we want to measure? And something that was sort of reassuring for our analysis was to find a positive correlation between markup and profit, because we don't want to measure the concentration itself, but let's say the abuse of this concentration, finding when firms charge too much. They charge prices that are beyond their marginal cost, and we got our confirmation. This slide summarizes overall what was our methodology. As you can see, I describe the first part of the analysis so far. We went through financial data of 117,000 firms. We calculated markup. We calculate the relationship between markup and productiveness, because we want to also see a relationship between these two. We aggregated markup through sector, those 39 sectors I was talking before, to country, and we arrived to a data set of sectorial country markup, to which we applied several shocks. These shocked values of markup were the input of our black box over there. I mean, the macroeconomic model I was describing before, that produced as a new level of GDP and its component with these new scenarios of competition, with these new scenarios of markup. What are these three scenarios? The three scenarios were discussed intensively with the Commission. We got three scenarios. One was named. Well, we have a nickname. I can tell you, since I mean, it's not in front of the Commission. There was the backward-looking scenario was named like Back to the Future scenario, since we were simulating what would happen without the increase of markup, without the increase of markup that Salvatore was mentioning at the introduction of our study. So that's the reason why he looked back, because he looked back to the history. Then there is like the Edward Scissorhand scenario, which is trimming, which means capping the worst 3%, the villain, as Alexis said. Those firms that have a markup which is too high within their sector, we kind of cap them and see what's the new markup level at the sector level without those three with the extra profit. And then scenario 3 was called Pleasantville, because it's sort of everything become homogeneous. We put down those countries that have a markup which is too high, an indicator of competition which is too high. That might depend on regulation, on several aspects, and we make them converge to the EU average. The results are not dramatically different because those three scenarios end up with similar impact in terms of markup changes, and so similar impact in terms of macroeconomic outcomes. I want to focus more on the sign rather than on the exact numbers. And as you can see, when we put our new markup level in our macroeconomic model, which is a model that take together all the relationship among countries, among sectors. I simplify, but it's quite a complicated machine. We found that overall, increasing competition will provide overall more growth. As you can see, the GDP sign is positive. And it keeps going. It keeps going because there is a sort of a virtuous cycle that makes competition increase in productivity, and also feed the growth for the next year. Then we have a positive impact on consumption. We have positive impact on investment. The more output we generate through the model call for more employment because we need resources, and for sure we have better international competitiveness because as Elena was describing before, prices goes down, input prices goes down, you become more competitive, and so you are more interesting for international buy. Conclusion. Let me conclude with a message which is the increasing market power of firms, the one that's been documented in the last 20 years, actually came at a cost, because there the table we were simulating an increase of competition. We have the opposite, so that means that those signs you have to see them with the opposite side. At the same time, the study confirmed that doesn't matter the way you do it, you do trimming scenario, you do pleasant will, you do regulation scenario. If you increase competition in the market, you can gain back what you lost. You can increase your economic performance. It's very important, I think, what we found within the development of the study, and the link between total factor productivity and competition level. There is a long debate on this. We tested here empirically. Nowadays, at this stage of technology in the European Union, we find a positive relationship. So more competition brings more productivity, and so that's actually goes back to the idea of having that as a pillar of long-term growth for the European economy. And then, the last point, it's something like a cautious note. For sure, like competition, it's complex to measure. There are probably other ways to affect it. I don't want you to take this presentation. I'm not the lottery guy who give you the numbers. It's not really important, the numbers. It's important the message. The message to take home from this study is that nowadays in the European Union, at the current stage of competition, an increase of competition might bring extra growth, extra welfare, extra investment for the overall economy.
Okay, thank you, Claudio. Thank you all. I think we don't have a lot of time left, so but maybe we have time for a final round of questions. Maybe keep your answers a little bit shorter than originally intended. So, of course, we are a bit biased because this is our report, but I think, you know, what we did, the work that we did speaks quite directly to the ongoing policy debate. So my first question is for Sean, actually, and here the link to the ongoing debate is quite straightforward. I'm referring to the work that, that you did on telecom markets. I think from what you find, it's relatively clear that as things stand, with markets being national in their geographic scope, further concentration would very likely be detrimental for consumers in that it would lead to higher prices and would not necessarily lead to an increase in investments. So maybe something that is maybe useful to reflect upon is what, in your opinion, I mean, if these markets become European in their geographic scope, perhaps this assessment would change and there would be, and the possibility of consolidation would become more concrete and would not necessarily be harmful. So what do you think stands in the way of these markets being more integrated, of these markets becoming one market, one single market for telecom services?
Well, I think the fundamental economics of the way mobile telephone systems work stands a little bit in the way. But let's pull back from that. So what matters for for our service here today is just a few towers that are around us and what's on those towers. So it's really a very local market. If we move to simply having a rule that says we're going to look at market share across Europe, as that's the one that's relevant, we'll have some market share thresholds. That could be a way to motivate some mergers, certainly, and then we get to the outcomes of those mergers. What will it's not a question of what the benefits will be. I think it's a question of how to get there. If you change the rules, then you will move perhaps towards creating a permissive environment for the mergers. But I think some of the mergers might not happen automatically. There may need to be a more aggressive pushing by political and regulatory forces to make them actually concretize in the end. Because a lot of companies would be effectively disappearing, and the whole equity structure of mobile telecoms in Europe would have to change.
Thank you, Sean. So the next question is for Elena. So you have explained how domestic competition in domestic markets is actually perceived by our exporters to be instrumental to their international competitiveness, to their competitiveness in export markets. However, our survey, by design, focuses on those industries where we are successful on a global stage. They are, by design, we've decided to focus precisely on those sectors of economic activity where our export performance is good. So, do you think that our results can be generalized somewhat, can tell us something deeper about the relationship between domestic competition and competitiveness? I mean, to what extent do you think that domestic competition and boosting domestic competition can be something that can help us become competitive where we are not now?
Okay. So, of course, I mean, we are, in this study, we analyzed only some sectors, sectors in which we are leading, I mean, in which we are doing very well in terms of exports. And therefore, I mean, of course, the results, you know, one should be cautious when generalizing to other sectors. Also, we are not considering services. So we are considering services in terms of inputs. So we learn something on services because we ask questions on inputs, but we are not analyzing firms that are operating leading export sectors in services. What I think we learned from our survey is, I didn't have time to deal about this issue in my presentation, but it's something about the relationship between somehow scale and competitiveness, or size of the firms and competitiveness. Because the firms we interviewed are not big firms in general. 3/4 of them are SMEs, and still they are active in leading export sectors. Again, as I told you, we don't know if they are leaders in these sectors, but what we know is that they are very active, at least in their sector. Most of them export to more than 5 extra EU countries, so they export. They have an export activity that is quite large, and therefore, maybe what this can tell us is that, these, at least in these sectors, we don't, possibly size does not correspond to global scale. So maybe you can be a leading firm globally even without being very big. This can be, this can happen in perhaps smaller sectors, at least in terms of value. So this means that, you may have global leaders even if they are not, very big firms. And this reminds, if Thomas Desenhofer would be here, I think he would mention the hidden champion story of Simon, no? So you don't need to be a very large firm in order to be successfully to have a success in exports. And this is not to say that size is not important. Of course, we know that scale is important. Salvatore mentioned the importance of scale for in some sectors, in particular for investments and so on. What our survey and our results, I think, say, and this, I think, may also be general, is that competition does not seem to prevent firms from reaching scale. So maybe there are problems somewhere else. We know that, for instance, the Draghi report mentions, and we all know it, capital markets that are not very well developed, and particularly venture capital markets that are not very developed in the EU. The problem, our survey, I think, confirms that the problem is not competition, the problem with reaching scale, so also the problem with perhaps being more competitive in some sectors is not scale. And also the problem with investment, is not that competition is preventing firms to invest, quite the opposite. At least according to, if we believe that our respondents, are truthful, I think what they say, what we learn is that actually competition helps improving investment, gives more incentive to invest, and that would also mean more competitiveness in exports.
So, Alexis, next question for you. So, one of your findings in the report is that the share of global superstars incorporated in the EU and the UK has declined quite significantly over the past 25 years, which also, is also consistent with one of the findings of the Draghi report. So why do you think, so it would seem that our companies, European companies, do face some struggle when trying to scale up compared perhaps to their counterparts in the US. So what do you think are the potential causes of this, and is competition enforcement and perhaps merger control part of the problem or not?
So first of all, I think I agree with Elena that, being big is not necessarily something beautiful. And I must say that when I saw the global superstars, I would, to some extent, think that the world would maybe be better if some of them were less successful at selling their products. So there is this element of to what extent do you want to be big, and is big so important, especially on competitiveness. Now. A number of big companies, and Draghi speaks more about listed companies. And it's interesting how Europe has less listed companies, or a less vibrant group of listed companies. And that, I think, is something that raises a number of questions. And I'll just raise the questions because I don't have the answers. But it's to me interesting that a number of big European companies, say the Aldis of this world, who are competing in the US now, whereas Walmart is not competing in the EU. Say E.CA is all over the world, and none of these companies have thought it was a good idea to grow by being listed, which is presumably idiosyncratical. Yet our markets seem to be less vibrant. And again, I'm not a specialist, so but I just see that listed firms are becoming less big in Europe, and there is less rotation amongst listed firms. First of all, I think that reading the Draghi and the Letta report is a very good thing to do. It's long, but it's a good thing. And one of the things that struck me is more, and again, I'm a little bit outside of my base competences, but I found that the lack of VCs, especially at scaling up, in Europe was quite impressive. And so Draghi in particular has very good data on that. And this, I think, raises questions, because we have savings in Europe. We export more than we import, which means that basically we also export our savings to other places. And why don't we collectively invest more in Europe and less in the US is, to me, a question mark. And especially, why don't we invest in more of this disruptive innovation is, to me, also a question mark. Why don't VCs become more active in Europe? I mean, so there are small companies, but when they grow bigger, they go to the US, which is, and this is, I think, a link that is maybe less easy to follow in Draghi's report, and in Letta's report also, by the way, it quickly jumps to the capital markets union, which I think is a good thing to have. They also jump quite quickly to the single market, which I think is a good thing to have. I'm not sure that having a fully implemented capital markets union or a fully implemented single market would solve our problem of scalability. I mean, it's again, I'm not sure that it's the first order effect. And leading to your real question about competition, I'm afraid that competition and mergers will not solve the problem. It depends on what you call the problem. It could solve the problem of becoming bigger, but it will not solve the problem of our competitiveness and of us having firms, scale at the stage where they become more competitive. So I think that, our discipline is a very important one, but I'm not sure that it can solve all problems. And in particular here, the instrument is maybe not as. And sorry, we are over time.
So, Claudio, very quickly, you continue to have the honor of concluding and tying things together. So in your approach, I mean, your work confirms that competition and therefore the protection of competition and the enforcement of competition law can be instrumental to growth rather than being an obstacle to growth. In your approach, I mean, your approach is to keep everything else constant and basically simulate a shock in markups, which is to simulate a shock in, well, an improvement in competitive conditions across the economy. Again, keeping everything else constant. If you think about the Draghi report, what is envisaged there, however, is perhaps, I mean, a significant plan for public investment. So if we do this mental exercise of combining the effect of this increase in public investment with policies aimed at improving, making markets more competitive across EU, how do you think those two things interact with one another?
Okay. Let me think. Well, let's start to say that extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. So, in a sense, I understand this is a new scenario where these two variables have to interact. But I honestly believe that I mean the Draghi report also underline how the lack of productivity within the EU mainly depends on few sectors. I mean, it's like the electronic sector. So I believe that I mean a digital, an investment plan that might foster the digital capability of the region would actually goes complementary to the idea of competition. I mean, nowadays we live in a world which is much more complicated than in the past. I mean, sometimes the competitive advantage of extra EU competitor comes from anti-competitive practice at home. So I do understand, I mean, the need to combine and to reduce the gap. And I also think that once a public investment plan would sort of initiate the process, then competition with its virtuous cycle, with natural selection, will actually improve the process. So I actually see more the complementarity rather than...
Okay, I think now we really need to stop. We are quite late, so I thank our speakers, I thank the audience for being here, and I also would like to thank, so the people that you see here are just 5 of 23 authors of the report, so this was quite a massive effort that was done in a year, basically. So I want to thank not just the people here on this stage, but also all of those that have contributed to the report. Thank you. Okay, we have the coffee.